I am glad to be presenting today Mr. Kotoz for our first presentation. He is an EU Mary Perry Fellow and Research Associate at KU Leuven Center for the Study of Culture and Society in Belgium. Following a career-long interest in the intersection of Arabic culture and digitization, he is currently conducting his doctoral research on the digital study of Arab Orientalist intellectual relations in the colonial era as part of the European network mediating Islam in the digital age. Mr. Kotoz, if you please.
First, I'd like to thank you for welcoming us here in Doha. After 2 years of relatively socially isolated research, it is a first breath of air to be able to share with you the contents of what has been in so far of individual research. So the following presentation is largely an accidental outcome of conducting my own historical PhD research on the development of the networks around the discipline of Orientalism or discipline in total during the colonial period. This research was aimed to be conducted in digital humanities schools, and therefore this presentation is informed both by the contents of my research sources, as well as the practical methodological challenges that I faced while using these sources. So, the flavor of this presentation first from reading the correspondence between Ahmed al-Daymāniyya and Father Nabi al-Khadījah, who were in addition to being two of the most important mediators of Arab-European scholarly networks specializing in Oriental studies during the colonial period, these were among the most important Arabic philologists of their time. In reading the correspondence, I noticed that the vast majority of it was dedicated to three activities. First, facilitating the exchange of literature and sources, often accompanied by annotations and highlights, highlighting connections of authorship and topical relatedness, which was rather challenging task at the period of, with uncertainty being based between in Iraq and Rome in the Vatican, Khadija also traveling all around the place. That was a rather challenging task that they were facilitating in these correspondences. And second was a debate on the etymology of proper nouns and bases in a time in which Arabic was witnessing a rather revolutionary period in relation to the colonial challenges it was facing. And thirdly, was debate on the authorship behind multiple manuscripts in a time of revival of Islamic classics and very heated race to securing these manuscripts and really limiting Islamic classics at the time. So I realized that this observation was a clear insight into one of the most central, yet mundane acts that constitute the practice of philology as we know it today. That is, the organized production of scholarly consensus, or to be more precise, of a standardized scholarly language promoting philological inquiry. That took place through cross-border and inter-institutional debate. And one process has largely been a resource and time-intensive process, and one does not have to look further than the correspondence itself mentioned above to realize the lenses and expenses these scholars have to go through in order to share a single text or to authenticate the spinning of a single biblical canon. I noticed that some of these activities equal to a large extent the challenges that I face on daily basis in studying large correspondence for my own research. Luckily, we live in an age of almost endless data, and amongst these, I believe one particular type gap as well for historical and philosophical research. That is metadata. Essentially, it is data about data. It is the textual data that helps process other data into meaningful information. It takes many shapes and serves many purposes, and is being continuously produced by all kinds of actors, for all kinds of actors, all the time, both intentionally and also often unintentionally. Archives and libraries are the most big producers of bibliographical metadata. For the big functioning of libraries in our age, in our digital age, the production of quality metadata by specialized librarians is essential. And this metadata is often further verified at the level of national libraries and archives. Putting together their catalog of metadata for smaller libraries, and by extension, metadata for some of the biggest digital holders around the world are pulled into internationally centralized databases that are probably familiar to many of you, like OCLC's World Cup or VA. Next. A fascinating side effect of the well-ending process of metadata production is what's called authority files, which are bits of biographical data altered as conventional names during birth and death date, and amongst many other types of information linked together from the major record holders around the world, as well as catalog publications in the holding of these record holders. The prime example is the database, the Virtual International Authority File database, which is also an OCLC project. And both are publicly available, are publicly available and accessible for both humans and machine actors alike. And this is a little biographical information being updated daily by dependable experts working in the world's leading library. And other examples of open database also exist on so many different topics, such as geographical places or and so on. At face level, these databases are valuable tools. At face level, these databases are very valuable tools that philological researchers can navigate and read to assist their research. However, the true potential here is much more fascinating than that. The fact that this information is both open and machine readable invites us to think of them in the framework of linked data, a framework that is very conceptually similar to social sciences' now very popular actor network theory. Essentially, it departs from the axiom that every bit of data is related to another and every other one in one way or another. It is an argument that no part of human knowledge exists in isolation of any of the other parts. Accordingly, these relations can be logically traced, or semantically, as computer sciences would problematically like to claim. Practically, this means that if any data set is structured in a conventional way, we can relate it to another that seems independent from it in one way or another, in a way that enables us to make meaningful hypotheses based from one data set about the other, which remembers the discussion of discovery. So, since that we know a certain scholar has published extensively with one particular publisher, we can easily extract information from such databases about other scholars who work with the same publisher. And we can also relate that to geographical location to come up with all kinds of hypotheses. And all of this can be done on a massive scale using simple digital analytic tools such as relational databases. And these tools are almost always because these databases are almost always conventional and machine readable by design. And I know this is very abstract so far, so I will thank the speakers to illustrate the potential of this approach, but I will use one of my own papers and leave it to illustrate. In studying the enormous request to the reality of here, which is a corpus made of more than 30,000 letters, I was faced with a list of more than 650 individuals that involved in constant communication. This list was produced as metadata, while the scientists cataloging this request as the Hungarian metadata. And this particular example of metadata is among the finest cases of quality metadata production that I have encountered. These names are accessible even if access to the content of the letters themselves is restricted. And while I was very familiar with many of those names, I was not familiar with the vast majority. So, realizing that a large chunk of these names would probably be a personal connection that would not be relevant to my research on intellectual relations, I wondered about the best way of fitting through these names to facilitate my ultimate goal, basically discovering previously unknown members of the International Network of Orientalism at the time. I started with extracting data in a machine readable format. And using a very useful software called Owen, I was not only able to clean all this data very quickly, but I was also able to link all these names to already existing authority file database. In order to verify the accuracy. Khadījah, on the one side, which is maintained by some of the world's leading printer libraries and accordingly authoritated. And Ghadījah, which is a more crowdsourced, popular database that is maintained by the volunteering public. Each of them might have been Lebanon, but in coordinating data between these two data, we can achieve much higher accuracy. In similarly, we also names in this list of 650 names that do not have any publications associated with them in the aforementioned libraries. Following that, it became possible to see where publications of those that are still included in the list are concentrated in which language and have an approximation of the geographical sphere of influence of the author. Further refinement was possible by filtering all these publications of these authors by genre predefined by the libraries themselves. We're talking about huge record holders such as the German National Library, the Biblioteca di Cantina, the Israeli National Library. These are like national level record holders who already have developed their own convention. So by dividing these, the authorship, the publications of these authors by genre that were predefined by these libraries, it allowed me to accurately pinpoint the individual writing in Arabic and on Muslim-related topics, which is what I'm interested in. And effectively discovering tens of little-known scholars that were located on these Orientalist networks that I had no idea about before, and many of them would never mentioned in the literature. Furthermore, I've also been linking these newly discovered relations semantically to the publicly maintained Wikidata knowledge, essentially being able to draw the connections that connected these scholars and utilize them later using simple queries and be able to produce visual representations of how the networks of these scholars look like. Next slide. So essentially, we're able to really produce the result that can come out of that. I mean, you are able to extract the information and you paste them from relational databases that can later lead you to pieces of information that weren't really existing on the literature or on the so my aim again. So my aim was to introduce the possibility and potential as food for thought for those present, especially the students or in the room, I can see. I'm really learning in partnership while thinking of our different research in a regional manner and towards overcoming the specialization induced isolation and rhyming around methodology and methodology and conceptualization so far. Because going back to the start of the presentation, I firmly believe that such possibility could have fitted perfectly with the philosophical activity that I witnessed in the Anstad Valley correspondence and would have made this philosophical effort much easier. And while this is not much of a conclusion, my aim was to open the floor for discussion and an imagination about how we can truly realize the potential in a network approach to humanity and the use of linked data. Thank you.
Does anyone have questions? Open now for questions.
Okay, let me start. This is very interesting, but I usually get this question when I talk to my students about like big data and the ability to see the scholar network and to discover them. How like when we say the phrase that there is no factual part or specific concept that we can rely on. But some things we saw that it started in France or in London or in Cairo or in Tunis. We then discovered that there was something about the same concept in Iran like 200 years before it. But we can be accurate with regard to the results of this kind of research where we use the digital tools to uncover these scholarly networks. This is one thing. The other thing is, you said that this will help us get to know some of the names that are not created with those Orientalists. However, they have been part of the discourse and they have been contributing to this kind of Orientalist discourse. And how this would affect what has been proposed by Edward Said in his Orientalism, for example. How this would affect the whole Orientalist studies or Orientalism studies over the last 2-3 decades, or 4 or 5 decades, since 1978 when I wrote this book. I hope this question is not that broad.
But I'll start by answering the first one. And you can be very clear about something. I'm not proposing a methodology. What I'm proposing with the research is basically a way of easing up the effort and the time consumed by the hunting of individual biographies and individual pieces of information using direct reading. But this is not at all going to be, and this I think was a little bit of conflict between. I don't believe that digital humanities can offer a proper alternative to deep reading. And so they have to sit down, especially history, read his sources very carefully, make assumptions, and make hypotheses and try to prove the hypothesis. But what this can offer is an aid, a way of facilitating how to look at the material you have and including new senses in it. Because really, the mapping is fancy and nice to see on the screen and so on, but the real not to have a graph have a track that you can follow from one point to the other using a visual sense and identify that there is a node here that is not explained, or there is someone showing up on this network here that we do not know much of. And then we delve into the details, we get the primary source and start reading and postcard. That's the first part of the answer to the first question. The second part is the beauty of this data is that it's essentially open-ended by nature. Really the whole idea is to have good research design that will not necessarily very clearly state a certain point of a certain social, cultural, historical phenomenon. But this is as far back as we can trace it, and we can always leave the door open and connections possible to earlier stages of the phenomenon. And this is precisely why we need more collective and open data sets and databases more than data sets. Because if you go back on the screen a little bit, back. One little picture. Oh. Yeah. It's basically a figure in which multiple actors and even can be crowdsourced that those scholars working on this topic will keep encountering new actors, new Orientalists, new scholars, new intellectuals. This computer is capable of working this information and reducing the semantic relationships between these individuals. And it can constantly be updated in real time. And like it can be located as this person came before that person, and it's connected to him in terms of publication, it's connected to him in terms of membership in academic society, connected, they attended this particular conference together, and so all these pieces of information were capable of producing them, and then eventually enabling the organic database through the daily interaction of researchers with it. So it essentially has to be an open source and a very open source database that is available to as many researchers as possible who are interested in this topic. This, I think, is trying to answer the first.
Yeah, I think what I mean is, you know, in literature, for example, Frank Moriti, when he talked about distant reading and close reading, this is exactly related to the first part where you mentioned that it's a tool that will help with the close reading rather than depending only on the distant reading. But what also Frank Moriti offers in his using digital tools in literature is to some extent redefine the canon, the literary canon. Like, how can we say that this is the English novels, this is, or the British novel, this is the Nigerian novel? Because we have always been very selective, taking only 45% of what is there to be representative. And this selectivity is based on ideology. Into history, where we have, like, if we can say that Orientalism in itself is a canon right now, and we have some selective writers who are selected to be representative of the Orientalist discourse. But by using these digital tools, we will uncover many things who were hidden, were not there. And this will change the way we think about Orientalism, will change the way we have known Orientalism as represented by Edward Said's book and the later writers. This is what I mean by myself.
Yeah, but the second question I talked about that for answering. I remember having a very interesting description of Edward Said as being one of the most brilliant critics in recent memory, but a terrible historian at the same time. And I personally believe in the validity of large aspects of the argument that Said put through. And unfortunately, we have a limited lack of historical consistency. This argument has been subjected to a lot of unfounded attack and criticism that I have many problems with, but on the accounts of the historical inaccuracy, not on the argument itself. So it's like a false flag attack on the argument itself. But basically, similar to what Matthew was proposing yesterday, by amassing the information, the very little information that we have on each of the actors we know, and finding the new actors in these networks, and not just that, but enabling others, and this is really fundamental importance when we're talking about link-based, enabling other researchers to contribute to the same flow of information, not to have people living on isolated islands talking about individuals that they discovered and wait for a third person to come later and make the association in the third article. The rules of the digital world are we can all contribute to the same goal, find a convention, and keep adding up to it, and we will eventually see that the database, and accordingly the network made from this database, will start growing and making more visual sense. Then we will be able to really rather easily evaluate the validity of the Saadanian argument or not, and even on the descriptive level as well as in the level of content when we delve into content itself. The rules of the game will change, but this is still information.
Does anyone else have a follow-up or a question?
It was very clear and important is that we start the PhD server at the School of Mathematics and Computer Science at Wolverhampton University in the United Kingdom. We're campaigning and also the green linguistics for the humanities, also in University of Wolverhampton. And it works on Arabic fake news detection and published paper on Arabic irony detection in social platforms. And the community and research are semantic marketing, fake news detection, sentiment analysis, and applications of deep learning architecture on natural language processing. Sounds very technical, and looking forward to learning a lot from you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning here in the UK. Okay, let's start. So this is the title of our paper that we submitted recently. Imad is a second author. He's with the audience today. So this is, we're trying to have sort of a macro understanding of Tarajem, which means the Arabic biographical dictionaries, by creating topological networks. So the outline for this presentation today, let me just start the timer, so I will not take more than my time. Okay. Okay, so I'll talk first about what are Arabic Tarajem and what is their historical value, and then the objective of our study, which is a part of a project that we started sort of a year ago, and how we compile the data set of biographical dictionaries, what are the challenges involved and how we tackle them. And I'm going to show also examples of how we visualize the topological networks of relations for various purposes. And finally, I'm going to end my presentation with some insights and any limitations that we had in the study. Can you hear me well, everybody? Okay.
If you can make the mic a little bit away from your, like.
Away. Okay, like that?
Low. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so Tarajem are the Arabic biographies, and this is, for example, they go back to pre-Islamic era. This is, for example, an image of one of them, the Arabic biographies. Can you see? If you can see, it's very small, but the Arabic is still without the dots, so still a very ancient, sort of. So the biography started in conjunction with the validation of the hadith transmitters, or what is known in religious studies as ilm al-rijal. For non-speakers in the audience, the hadith is the sayings of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet, and the biography started in order to validate the honesty of the transmitter, to describe his life and his pedigree, his father, and all that, to validate the honesty of the transmitter of the hadith. But then the genre developed later on to include not just the transmitters of hadith, but all types of scholars like exegetes, poets, doctors, even musicians. And we have classical Arabic biographies that are very famous, like Siyar A'lam al-Nubala for al-Dhahabi, as well as other biographies that are concerning different fields of knowledge. So actually, when we started this project, we found that amazingly enough, there are like 1 million entries in Arabic biographical dictionaries, not just for the classical, but even the modern, because this genre still persists in the Arabic literature up to present day. Sometimes we have a biography published recently in Egypt, of Algeria, where it collects all the classical biographies as well as modern entries for characters eminent in the modern field. So sort of the Tarajem are very important source of knowledge for Islamic culture, and we can also see it as an important source of human history in general, because it spans over a long period of time and describes geographical and spatial aspects of people's life. So the objective of our project or study is to try to create, first, we wanted to create a data set of biographical entries that is not specific to one biography or field of knowledge. We wanted to have a data set from different fields of knowledge, and we wanted to span from the pre-Islamic to the modern era. Our second objective was that we wanted to see how we can use natural language processing tools to structure this, which is going to be unstructured data set, how we can extract attributes in order to build relational networks between individuals in these biographical entries. So we propose also to use semantic similarity metrics. I'll explain this a bit later, to create these networks. And the networks are sort of, we can look at it as sort of a macro interpretation of biographies. Researchers usually, when they study biographies, they study it on a macro level, where they look at one eminent person, perhaps one biography describing the literary style of the biography, the history of that person. But what we are providing is sort of a macro interpretation of biographies, how we can create relations from a huge data set of individuals. And we also provide an experimental way of visualizing these networks so that scholars can interpret any cross connections between individuals from a spatial temporal perspective. And we'll see how this was done in a minute. So how we compile the data and what are the challenges involved. When we started off with the project, we found that there is an abundance of biographical material, as I mentioned. However, we were lucky enough to come upon this online encyclopedia. It's called موسوعة التراجم والأعلام. It's an online encyclopedia. You have the link here if you want to share the presentation, if anybody's interested to take a look at it. And this encyclopedia, what is good about it is that it consists of 30 biographical dictionaries, the classical ones, the most famous classical ones, as well as other non-classical, so from the modern age. So it consists of about 1 million entries. The eras that are covered in this online encyclopedia is from pre-Islamic era to the modern period, which is exactly what we wanted. So we have the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. You see, it's very varied. And the notable persons belonging to different categories. So we have religious categories, companions of the Prophet, we have philosophers, physicians, warriors, scientists, all fields of knowledge. There are two particular categories in this encyclopedia that was of importance to us. The first category is called Majahil, or the unknown. And this is something that usually in classical biographies, they have this category to talk about a person, a woman or a man who is not really known for a particular thing or a particular knowledge, but he's sort of involved in an anecdote or a famous story where another eminent person is involved. And the main purpose for having these, like in Sir A'lam al-Nubala, for example, why they have this category in particular also to validate the story. So they mentioned this unknown person to validate the story. The second category that was of interest was the women biographical notices. The encyclopedia had this gender specification, whether the entry was a woman or a man. And this is very important also in our relational network, because we wanted to see what type of relations we can explore, again, on a macro level for women across these 10 eras. So we did not actually work with the 1 million entries. As I said, this is an experimental. On the experimental level, we worked on 45,500 entries. We scrapped this with beautiful soup, which is a Python library to scrap material from the internet. However, after we scraped the data set, we were faced with a couple of challenges. The first challenge was the length of the entry itself. Because it's collected from different biographies, we have different the length varied widely. For example, we can have in one of the biographies, Al-A'lam, for example, you can have just one sentence about the biography is just one sentence. For example, Amina Bint Anan, a noble woman from Baghdad. She recited hadith in Baghdad and Mosul, lived and died in Mecca. So that's it about it. But in other places, we have some eminent persons. We had several pages. So it's sort of like proportional. The amount of pages or the amount of text is proportional to the importance of that individual. So in order to avoid bias with the natural language processing tools, we opted for using only the shorter notices in the longer entries to have a consistent length. The second challenge was the fact that because of different biographies, we have inconsistent style. What I mean by inconsistent style is that we wanted to hard code the attributes for the network. To hard code the attribute means to have, for example, the era. We need to have just one word for that: Islamic. Gender, for example, woman. A geographical proximity, you have to have the exact city of the place of birth or death and so on, or a combination of these attributes. So the way the biography or the entry expressed this information varied considerably. So for example, if we want to extract geotemporal information about birth and death, we can have Ibn al-Naqib, Egyptian Shafi'i, his birth and death in Egypt. So his birth, and of course, those who speak Arabic in the audience would understand what this means. This is, of course, a translation. So his birth and death in Egypt. And then we have Ibn al-Dabbagh, a linguist from the people of Baghdad. So this is another way to express the place of birth. We wanted only to extract this Egypt and Baghdad, only that, not all of it. So this is an example that is more intricate, a subtle example of how to extract information, spatial temporal information. Ibn Majid, for example, and this is a snapshot from the encyclopedia. In order to get when he lived, what time he lived, or who are his contemporaries, you have to extract this from the text itself. In an indirect way. So, for example, this is a translation of this part, just first part of it. For example, Ibn Majid, the line of the sea, one of the prominent Arab navigators in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and the Sea of China. He is the sea captain who guided Vasco da Gama, the head of the Portuguese fleet, to the route in his trip from Melinda to the eastern coast of Africa to Calcutta in India. So what you understand the historic period can be inferred from the fact that Ibn Majid and Vasco da Gama were contemporaries. So we get it that it's in the 15th century AD, to see how difficult it is to extract such information. So we used a natural language processing tool to structure the data. We did not, of course, get 100% of all the information that we wanted, but to a very large extent, we managed to get a lot of attributes. The first way to extract places of birth and death, we did this through two steps. The first step is that we used regular expressions to extract trigrams, let's say 3 words, that would precede or follow, typically precede, follow place of birth and death. Just to give an example, of course, this is in Arabic, but I'm translating in English. His birth was Mecca. So we extract these 3 phrases, and we assume that then the word that we need is the fourth letter, the fourth word. For example, he died in Aleppo. Again, we had a bit of an untraditional way to explain, to express the place of birth. The literal translation, of course, Cordoba is the place where his head has fallen, for example. So we extract this part, which means where he was born. And then we assume that this is the name of the place or the word that we need for his place of birth. The second step is that after we did the first step of regular expressions, we had these phrases. So we do not need the whole phrase, we just need only the word that indicates the location. So in order to extract the location, we did that through named entity recognition, or NER, and this is a natural language processing technique where you train a machine learning model on places or names of places, names of persons or institutions, and so on. And then the model extracts these places automatically. We use the pre-trained tool, which is Camel NER tool. This is a Python kit for Arabic NLP by Obaid et al. And this tool would manage to extract modern names of cities like Baghdad, Aleppo, Mecca, and so on. However, these entries, as I said, some of them are from classical Arabic biographies. So some of the names of the cities are not there because this tool is trained on the modern geography of the Arab world. So we used our own dictionary from, actually, this is an Arabic biography about names of cities and places. So we use programming tools to extract names of older names of cities. Like, for example, Istanbul is Constantinople, Khorasan, Bukhara is Uzbekistan, and we needed the modern names in order to have it mapped geographically. So, for example, also cities in Spain under the Islamic ruling, such as Casta, Mallorca, and so on. The second attribute that was not very challenging, really, the dates. We had to just use regular expressions. If you can see here, for example, we have 2 types of dates, the AD, the Gregorian calendar, and the Hijri, AH. And it was straightforward. Just if you have this letter, we find that's Gregorian, and we have the Ha letter is the Hijri. And this is how we separated both calendars. What is more challenging, or the most challenging, was to extract the position of the individual. We wanted to know if he's a philosopher, a doctor, a poet. And of course, this is inside the text itself. And to do that, again, we did this through 2 steps. The first step is we took the whole corpus collectively, and we transformed it into what we call vector space in natural language processing. This is how we change the words into numbers, and the type of numbers that we use, or the vectors that we used for this particular purpose, is TF-IDF frequency. Just not to get deep into the technical matters here, it's just simply stated, is that you get the frequency of the word in terms of how frequent it is in the whole corpus, not in just the document in which it occurs. So, for example, if a word does not occur frequently in one particular document or in documents, this means it has higher load of information. So we use this TF-IDF matrix for each document, and we ran a k-means clustering algorithm, which is a machine learning model where you assign groups of documents together according to their TF-IDF value, and then this is how you get clusters from the corpus. As I said, we collected the corpus together as if it is one whole text. So you cluster the documents together where they have similar clusters. To show you an example, for example, from the TF-IDF, we have one cluster here, and we found that the cluster belongs to Al-Quran, for example. And the TF-IDF gave us these positions: Islamic exegete, tafsir, fuqaha, jurisprudence, hadith narrator, and so on. So this is one cluster. And we opted for taking the most frequent positions in the data set. So if, for example, we have a scientist, a poet, a judge, a captain, a sea captain, and so on. And this was the final format for the attributes. I don't know if you can see that. So we have, these are the attributes that we used to have our network between individuals. So we have the age, we have the gender, of course the name, and this is a summary. This is only part of the summary seen on the image here. Date of birth in Gregorian, date of birth in Hijri, date of death, again in both calendars. And we see, of course, a lot of them were not available. It's not just we did not find it, but many of many of this information is not available in the dictionaries themselves, and then the position and place of death and place of birth. So we come to the first objective, which is to create relational networks for eminent figures. We chose, for example, one eminent figure. As I said, this is just a small scale example, and I'm just going to show only a cross-section of the network for the purpose of this presentation. For example, we chose Ibn Hanbal. And of course, Ibn Hanbal is, all the Arab world knows him, but just to give a brief idea of who he is, he's an Islamic scholar, famous for the Hanbali school of thought, a traditionalist. And what we did is that we used two types of semantic similarities to see how Ibn Hanbal is connected to this huge data set that we have. Specifically his contemporaries. We use what is called sentence BERT. I will not explain BERT a lot, but this is again another way of turning the words into numerical values, where we have the text as a vector itself, and then we calculate what is called the cosine similarity between the textual data. So cosine similarity is that you calculate the cosine angle between the two vectors, which each vector represents a text. So for example, if two texts are closer in space, the vectors are closer in space, this means that they are more similar. So this is an example of only a cross-section of Ahmed ibn Hanbal, a relational network. The arrows, the thickness of the arrow indicates a higher cosine similarity. What we found is that before I start explaining this part of the network, this is a very nice quotation by Doring in 2015, and he says that network diagrams in digital humanities, of course, become meaningful when they are part of a dialogue with data and other sources of information. So we have to know who is Ibn Hanbal, what's his life about, and what's his biographical entries telling you, and his contemporaries as well, in order to understand what this relational network means. So we found the expected relation, which is expected, is that Ibn Hanbal, for example, is connected to Hanbal ibn Ishaq, if you can see that, his protege, his son, Abdullah ibn Ahmed. But we also found that he's closely connected, for example, to al-Mu'tasim, and this is the 8th Abbasid Khalifa. And why is that? Because he had an incident with al-Mu'tasim, where al-Mu'tasim imprisoned Ahmed ibn Hanbal due to a conflict about the vision, his interpretation of the Quran, and it's a famous conflict about the Mu'tazila and all that. So because he imprisoned Ahmed ibn Hanbal, he tortured him. So we found that they are connected in our relation, very close in our relation network, due to this political background. And there are a lot of other things that we can understand here as well from the network. I'll just give you another example that may not be that you might not able to extract this easily manually if you're just looking at the biographies. Al-Hakam al-Masri, for example, and this is another scholar, Sunni scholar that's contemporary to Ahmed ibn Hanbal. He also adopted the same idea against the Mu'tazila, but he's not as famous as Ahmed ibn Hanbal. He was not imprisoned by al-Mu'tasim. He kept saying about the same ideas that Ahmed ibn Hanbal, but that's why he's really connected, because he's adopting the same idea. He's contemporary, but he's not as famous as Ahmed ibn Hanbal. So this information can go as, we can expand this network in as far as the purpose of research is structured, in as far as the researcher wants to expand it. And I said this is a macro interpretation of the whole data set. So we do not go deep into just the entry. We sort of get what type of relations are there, and we have to go back to the data to understand why we have this closeness to Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Another type of relation network that we constructed is a relational network to a thematic vector. We created one theme, and the theme was about women fighters. So we created a theme that has all of a vector, of course, that has all the words related to battle related synonyms like fight, jihad, ghazwa, and so on. And we wanted to see, this is a vector in our space, as I said, and we try to calculate the cosine similarity of all the women entries in our data set and how close any of the women is to this vector of women fighters. So this is what we have here. Again, this is only a cross-section of our network, just to explain how the graphical network works. So this, you can see here, we have the women fighter. This is the nodal theme that we have in the graph in our network. And then we have different women related to this vector. So we have, for example, from the Islamic era, we have Amara, Hind bint Utbah, Kulthum, Safea. And then we have other and these numbers are the cosine similarities in this particular part of the network. So, for example, we have these women are all involved in fighting somehow. So what is interesting as well is that we have also a connection with a modern, not a modern, but an Ottoman Empire character, Ismat al-Iskandarani. If you go into the entry, you found that she's an author. She was involved in the Crimean War between Turkey and Russia, and her father died in this war. So again, because we have her cosine similarity is closer to this vector, it is somehow connected to Amara and the other women. We also calculated what is called degree of centrality. Simply stated, the degree of centrality is that you calculate the importance of the node. So if a node have larger number of connections, this means it has higher degree of centrality in our graph. We found, for example, that Amara had the highest degree of centrality. This means that it's sort of a pivotal node in the graph. Again, this is only an example of how we can use a huge biographical data set to understand some relations. The final type of network that we use is the spatio-temporal network. And for this reason, we used Palladio. Again, I have a link here if anybody's interested to check it out. So this is a tool set designed by Stanford University. And we wanted to see one particular category, as an empirical example. For example, poets. We want to see poets who lived in 3 eras: the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the modern period. We wanted to see how the geographical network can show us the differences between places of birth and death of poets during these 3 periods, and if it has shifted somehow on the according to the temporal aspect of the data. So this is again from the data set that we created. So this is geographical network for poets, places of birth and death in the 3 eras. You can see here the Levantine area, or Sham as it was called at this time. It's a focal area where the line indicates where the place of birth and connection to the place of death. This is sort of a network as well. So we have a lot of poets here in this area, and then with modern times we get them a little further to Egypt, perhaps in northern Africa, and we have also some in Eastern Europe. So we had a shift from the Levantine area to the western part of the Middle East, like Egypt and northern Africa and so on. Okay, I conclude with the limitations and some insights. So what we did is that we experimented with a large unstructured data set of a collection of Arabic biographical dictionaries that covered 10 eras in our data. We used natural language processing tool, and we found that they were very useful to extract attributes from unstructured data. We also use different similarity metrics to build the topological network. And we found out that this macro interpretation of biographies can give diversity of insight and utility of analysis for scholars besides their micro interpretation. The graphical visualization of cross connections were also very useful. But there is one limitation to this study, is that we found out that the graph, when we use a larger number of entries, the graph does not become really informative. So you have to decide, according to the purpose of the research itself, how far you want to go, which part of the data you want to focus on, rather than just dumping in the whole data set and trying to create this relation network. Thank you very much for your listening, and I'm glad to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Hadeel, for this extremely interesting presentation. And this is a very comment from my friend, because I found it extremely fascinating. I think it's best that we open the floor for questions, one speaker at a time, and I think you share some consistency. I'll leave the floor, and the one who has questions, I have a couple. You had a
I can barely hear you. The voice is a bit muffled. Yeah. So I guess you were thanking me for the presentation. Well, thank you.
No.
I think we should talk in the computer.
That would create a reverb.
I can hear sort of a muffled voice.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, reverb. What happened here?
Not sure.
I think maybe the mic set. Yes, I am.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you very well now.
I think speaking of here. So I started by thanking you for this very informative and very interesting presentation, which I personally find extremely interesting and relatable. I'll open the floor for questions on the offline and the online sides of the room. We have a question here.
Can you hear me from here?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, just thank you for your presentation. I just have one question. Did you measure the accuracy of the information that you extracted? Do you have a sense of the precision of it? You extracted some information like birth, date, place, etc. But did you measure the accuracy of this information?
The
Can you hear
accuracy,
that again?
let me just rephrase that just to make sure that I heard it correctly. Did I validate the accuracy of the?
Exactly.
As I said, the style of the biography is so inconsistent. So, and I understand. Perhaps you understand Arabic, so you know how difficult it is just to extract the name of the place of birth, for example. There are different ways to say that in Arabic. So we did as much as we can, but definitely the ones that we extracted were correct. So if we extracted, for example, Damascus, Dimashq, Qahira, it was correct. Yeah, it was the place of birth because we had this, for example, Wulida fi, and then the name of the city. However, in sometimes we couldn't extract that. So we tried to do the phrases as much as we can. And so, yeah, the one that we extracted were correct.
So, but maybe there is some database that you can also validate your information. For example, you can maybe with Wikipedia maybe or something to just refine the information in your results.
To use the Wikipedia to refine the results in what way? If you could explain a little bit.
Just doing a double check with some information. When you extract Damascus, for example, that doesn't mean that the author was born in Damascus. He is related to Damascus, but you can maybe look for in another database.
I got you. Check. So you want us to double check? Yeah, the problem with natural language processing tools and how we work with big data is that you cannot really manually double check 4,500 entries. This is not possible. The data set is huge. So there must be a margin of error. But as I said, it's a macro interpretation. Always with big data, there is a margin of error. But for example, if we take a look at the map that I've showed, you have, even if there is a margin of error, you still have statistically poets in Egypt in the Levantine area. So you know that they were actually concentrated in this area, even though you might have a margin of error. So if you get my idea, so for example, if you have 45,000 entries and you have a margin of error of 1,000, that's completely fine. But still you get the statistical picture of how far the geographical information changed among these three areas that we checked for poets, for example. So
if I may add,
yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were done. Please continue.
So we did a manual check as much as we can when we extracted the data from the data itself. For example, we wanted to see that our approach for extracting the trigrams was correct, the phrases were actually correct, but we did not double check with Wikipedia. Just what we usually do is that we extract only part of the data set and to make sure that our programming tool is working fine.
And if I may contribute to the discussion, because I think we're onto something. Have you thought about validating your data, or before validating your data, comparing your data with some sort of consistent identifiers of place names, for example, or authority files in terms of, so that we would have a certain consistency and profiling taking place. And that way we're no longer dealing just with textual data, as in names of particular individuals or particular places, but rather with complete profiles. Because I think this can easily lead to further expansion of the efficiency of the reach of the research once you start exploring linking this data that you have already arrived at and these profiles that you are going to produce to larger and already existing bodies of data that already exist on the internet or in institutional repositories.
Mm-hmm.
Am I making any sense here?
Yeah, that's a very good idea, but we have not tried that. Perhaps we can extend to have this profiling with a data set. Yeah, this is a good idea.
Yeah, I think also it will be very beneficial in referencing the data and validating through different data sets that exist in different places, just by having these persistent or consistent identifiers going through.
Yeah. By the way, I have the data set as well as the programming tools on GitHub. Perhaps I forgot to give a link to that. I can always send this to Dr. Aid if anybody's interested to replicate the experiment.
That was my question. Is it available for other researchers? So thank you. If you can,
yeah, I have it as open source on GitHub. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll refrain from asking further questions and leave the floor open to Peter Koppen.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Peter, I can hear you.
Okay, very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for presenting this. I really enjoyed it. This afternoon, I will present something on a network that I tried to build from a database. Something I was really struggling with, and I was wondering what your vision is on it, because I was triggered because of what you told about Al-Mu'tasim Billah and Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Our relationships, I mean, we know this from our own lives, they tend to be unstable, like they change over time, and I think it's the same with scholarly networks. So at some point, a student will teach or study with a certain teacher, but they will get into conflict and he will switch teachers, or a scholar has a very good relationship with a certain scholar, but they have a difference of opinion about something and they go apart. And what I'm struggling with in my own network is it is a very fixed network in a sense. And I was wondering, in this type of networks that we are building, how can we incorporate the contingency in relationships that are a normal part of individual human life? Does it always need our own zooming in, so to speak, or is there also a way that we can show this in a network, how these networks also change within a lifetime of an individual? I was wondering whether you have a solution to that. So also the emotional aspect, so to speak, because now they're very static. I hope the question is clear.
What's your network about? What's your data set about?
It's about 20th century scholars in Damascus and student-teacher relationships.
Ah, that's interesting. The only thing that comes to mind is sentiment analysis. So, for example, if you have, I don't know what type of data you have, if you have textual data where you can do some sentiment analysis and perhaps decide whether it is positive or negative at a particular period of time. So, if, for example, you have a text where we have a relationship between a teacher and a student, and then I'm not really sure what your data set looks like, but if this is the only thing that comes to mind, if you have, for example, a frequency of negative words and positive sentiment in particular period, perhaps this would give you sort of a temporal change of the relationship and how it has changed. Of course, the unstructured data, natural language processing, as I said, you need to have huge data in order to accommodate for the margin of error. And but this is one thing you can do, because it has its limitations, of course, because you cannot do this manually and check this beats the objective of digital humanities. You have to do this automatically. So sentiment analysis would be a good idea if you want to check how far the sentiment or the emotions, even if you want to use machine learning and emotion detection, and see how far, for example, the particular emotion is connected in a certain period with a certain relation in this part of the network.
Thanks a lot. I hope to be
If I may,
if that's okay.
if I may debate that last bit for a moment, because I think temporality needs to be added to such networks on a more basic level, which is it's something that we hear often about how static network analysis from this vein can be. And I think the integration of temporality in there needs to happen on a more basic level, in which all the data coming into the network should have a certain temporal aspect to it, a temporal feature or trait that can automatically generate a more dynamic network in a sense. For Peter, have you encountered or heard of node goat before? Because I think it really can help with what you're trying to achieve.
Yes, I've heard about it. Actually, I've only worked with Gephi until now, but I would like to learn more about other programs actually. So yeah, but my database is made for Gephi at the moment. Yeah, Gephi also has the option of temporality. Yeah,
To an extent, but I think the transformation of the data to be compatible with node goat is very possible and not problematic. I think it's the other way around. You wouldn't be able to move from node goat easily to Gephi. But I think really it's the relational aspect of it, being able to define the traits from the very beginning at the data model about what you mean, for example, by companionship or studentship and so on, and be able to differentiate that on the trait level, I think can be very helpful. Sorry for the interruption. Any further questions? Okay. We thank you once more, Hadeel, and we head to our next speaker. So, yeah,
Please.
The graduate student at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. She works in the field of media and cultural studies, and her main research interests are visual digital culture in the Middle East North Africa region, and archiving cultural products and heritage in the same region with a focus on Libya.
Thank you. Can you hear me well, first of all? I'm trying to present what my...
Can we get some feedback on the sound from our virtual attendees? Yeah. No. Okay. Can you hear us?
لا you can't. حيطلع ريفرب من هنا. The mic has to work.
There's something wrong. Can anyone from our virtual audience tell us if they can hear us? No, you can't even hear me.
That you said yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
They can speak.
Yeah,
Can you hear me from here?
Yes.
Can you hear me? You can hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Share
I
it.
can hear.
I will share my presentation with you actually because an issue.
Oh, you send it to me?
Yes. Okay. The computer stopped working. It would not click the presentation. Reopen. Okay, let me try. Yes.
And then you have to
Presentation. Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Safea al-Tayyib. And my paper is about mapping the representation of Arab Jews in Egypt, a comparative study of Al-Manar and al-Risala. This is a co-written paper between me and Dr. Mohammed. I'd like to start this with defining what mapping is in the case of this paper. It's a chronological mapping of representation. And when I say mapping, I approach this paper through looking into what were the main representations, the themes or the topics related to specifically Arab Jews and how they developed. Now, this is quite relevant in the case of the corpus that we have, which is Al-Manar and al-Risala. These are two magazines that were published in Egypt towards the end of the 19th century all the way to the mid of the 20th century. So this period of time has experienced, you can guys see my notes, I just realized that. How can I make that disappear? Anyhow, I'm not sure, but to go on this, Al-Manar and al-Risala, they cover the first 50 years of the 20th century, which happens to be a period where multiple events have occurred in this region. Colonization existed, and then there was the fight to remove the colonization. There was also the occupation of Palestine, which really influences the representation of the Jews. But one important thing to understand about these two magazines and how they're different is, let's start with Al-Manar. Al-Manar covers the first half of the 20th century. Al-Manar also, the editor-in-chief of Al-Manar was Rashid Rida, who had more or less religious ideology, so this is something to always keep in mind. As for Al-Risala, the editor-in-chief was Ahmed Hassan al-Zayyat, and he has more literary approach. So even the genres of the text that exist in these two magazines differ, but also the perspective where certain topics are presented. Al-Manar has a more religious perspective. Al-Risala is not more secular, but leans more towards literary text as well, or something more cultural than it is religious. So by having these two magazines, we're getting an outlook of multiple thinkers or in that period who would have different ideologies or different approaches, and also this period represents the establishment of the modern day era, what that means. Now, the two magazines were published simultaneously for 4 years, which will be from 1932 to 1935. And this is kept in mind throughout the research. Now, the methodology that I've used is I've started with distant reading or using computational tools to understand how are Jews mentioned in these magazines. After I get this outlook that the computational tools can give me, I go deeper through a closed reading, specifically a discourse analysis. Now, the choice of discourse analysis comes from the importance of contextuality at that time, and in order to understand how multiple events changes representation and to map representation, really. So I'll start with Al-Manar graphs. Al-Manar graphs are in the case of Al-Manar, in 100 topics modeling using computational tools, we find that there are 2 topics that focus on Jews. As you can see in the graph, it's from 1898 to 1933, which is the publication period of Al-Manar. The topic 66, we see that the mention of Jews comes in relation to other religions. So this is the first theme or topic that we can notice. So Christ, Jews, Bible, Christians, book or holy book, crucifixion, Torah, God, the Isa, Christian, Bible, our earth, land, Israel, travel, era time, Gospel of Matthew, Old Gospel of John, students. So here we see the mention of Judaism and Christianity, and no mention of Islam. This is quite important. Also for this graph, we see it peaking around 1912 to 1914. So these are the major peaks in these graphs. And from this, I can immediately deduct that there is this topic of Judaism, Christianity, or the mention of this. I don't know what are the opinions or perspectives on it, but I know that there is this topic that I need to look at. The second graph shows Jews, Palestine, Maghreb, France, Arab, Zionist, Berber, Aqsa, Jew, French country, Maqdis, Mosque, Holy Nation, Tribe, Algeria, Maghreb, World Earth. Now this I divide into 2 topics. One is the Jews in Palestine, or the idea of Judaism and Palestine. This is a very important idea, but I think what I was personally shocked at when I saw this is the mention of Al-Maghreb. Algeria, you have Morocco, you have France. These introduce, to me, they introduce the topic of colonization, the dichotomy of an Eastern Jew and a Western Jew, to look deeper into what that means, really. Another important thing is the mention of Zionism. That's very important for me to keep in mind. But to go back on the second topic, we see that it's peaking between 1928 and 1930. And now this is a period where there were a lot of fights against colonizers. Also the changes in Jews, the introduction of colonizers doctrine in North Africa, and how that creates the Eastern Jew, Western Jew dichotomy, which we will look at further in close reading. Now, going to Al-Risala offers a bit of a different representation. Now, Al-Risala is from 1933 to 1953. So, for these years, we noticed that the Zionist movement is strengthening in the region. And so, when we look at this, we notice that the peak happens in 48, which is the declaration of the occupation of Palestine, the state of Israel. So, this is just this is something that I personally expected. The Zionism, the Jew, the mention of Jew, the mention of the language, also Arabic, Quds, or Jerusalem, all of these countries, these mentions were quite, as well as Arabism, Arabs. So there's a discussion of identity here. Now, these are all the graphs that combined together, all three graphs combined together. I wanted to look at the share deal, which is 1932 to 35. If there's anything that is significant or mutual between these 4 years, I personally did not find much in that regard. Like, there isn't, the topics are not going in the same direction through computational tools, but also in closed readings, there aren't quite the same mentions. These two magazines take two different approaches to the topic of Arab Jews. Now, to add to all of this, we are using sentiment analysis graphs as well in order to understand how the sentiment has developed over time. This is an outlook of just understanding, is it positive, is it negative, or is it neutral? Now, this is in terms of the distance reading. Going into closed reading, I was guided by what I found in distant reading, and I went into selections of articles in both magazines based on what I believe, based on the distant reading and the keywords that the distant reading gave me, or the thematics that the distant reading gave me, and I conduct a discourse analysis on these articles. Now, the first finding is the notion of Jew and Zionist. Now, these two words were used a bit interchangeably for a while. Until the 1930s, that's when the major shift actually happened, including specifically actually in Al-Manar. This is quite interesting because for Al-Risala, we really cannot compare prior to the 1930s. But Al-Manar gives us a time where even the Zionist movement was not widely known, was not powerful in the region. So there wasn't the notion of a Jew and a Zionist in the Arab mindset. There was just the notion of the Jew. And with time, in Al-Manar, specifically Rashid Rida, who's the editor-in-chief, prior to the 1930s, actually the 1910s and 20s, he would speak positively of the Jews. He would showcase positive characteristics to them. But later on, the text starts focusing more on Zionism and focusing more on negative characteristics. So even in the sentiment analysis, it starts with it wasn't positive as is, as in it wasn't completely positive. There were a negative and a positive mention of them, but after the 1930s, it was completely negative mention. This is specifically focusing on Zionists as well. The second one is the notion of an Arab Jew, the Oriental and Occidental Jew. Now, when looking into this, and what colonization has done to the region is that it placed, or for Jews in specific, or the Jewish communities, it placed the concept of an Eastern Jew superior to the concept of an Oriental Jew. The values and the practices of a Western Jew are more important than the Orientalist Jew, including introducing practices of Western Jews that have not existed in the region, even though in the case of Egypt and the entire region, Jewish communities have existed for one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, really, and they have their own practices, their own beliefs. But when colonization came, that shifted. So that's something that's highly mentioned.
Oriental and Eastern in Arabic, since these are, what's the difference?
Western.
What's the word that the journal uses to distinguish Oriental from Eastern?
The journal uses in itself? Yeah. Yahud Arabic. اليهود العرب.
They shifted from Oriental Jews to Eastern Jews.
No, I meant they broadened the Western Jew value on the Oriental Jew. So this is what happened. Sorry. The last one is the Jew and the Christian. Now, this is quite important in terms of quantity on its own. Christianity is mentioned quite more heavily. It is critiqued quite more heavily. Jews and Judaism mentioned in general are not, I wouldn't say not significant, but they're not one of the major topics that you can find in the journals, really. And this goes back to the status that the Jews have held in Egypt in specific. They had their own communities. They were actually respected in these communities. They have not participated, and this is, I think, one of the limitations of this research is I cannot identify who might be a Jewish writer, because that would take the direction of the research a little bit into understanding how Arab Jews also represented themselves or perceived themselves, which is not included in this case. But according to the literature review that I've seen, Jews or Egyptian Jews in specific have separated themselves from the Muslim and Christian communities. They would have their own magazines, their own cultural activities, their own communities, and they would not integrate much with other communities. But one important thing that I found is that there isn't a dichotomy or a mention between Islam and Judaism, which is the idea that I went into this research trying to understand. Is there this dichotomy between Judaism and Islam, which I found that no, that does not exist in the research, in the journals, really. And thank you, this is it. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Safea. As usual, I open the floor for questions here in the virtual world, in the metaverse, wherever. Please.
Yes.
But you talk very uncomfortable. Because as a historian who deals with material documents, things like this, there's something called historical context. I don't really what's the point of just looking for the word, the term Jew in here and that here in the newspaper, and this here corresponds with it, and I can come up with a graph. I mean, what do we learn out of this? That is not clear, if we read the context and think of the historical context, Zionism, relationship between communities, religious communities, changes in Egypt, right? But one of the context is one of the context. It's all about context. Maybe, I'm not sure, maybe this is something strange for me, but and I don't mean this as a critique, particularly for you, but somehow I felt new generation is based on knowledge somehow. Maybe you can explain to me why looking for terms in certain newspapers and not others. And of course, maybe the agency of the Jews themselves. What about the newspapers that Jews produce, whether in Egypt or in Palestine or somewhere else? What about Zionist newspapers? I don't know. It seems arbitrary to take just newspapers. What is useful? I'm still confused. Why is it important that these two journals and millions of the term Jew is particularly significant when some sort of statistical reality, so to speak.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I like the question because it's something that I did ask myself as it started. The first thing it would be that the computational tools allows me to process large sets of data that I cannot process on my own. And I have used computational tools. What? I use this? Okay. Can you hear me? I have used computational tools to guide the close reading, the discourse analysis of these texts. Now, what if I care about the keywords? When I'm saying representation, then every word matters. The use of Yahudi versus Zionist is quite important. And so what was even more important to me to understand is the choice of these two magazines comes at the beginning of the 20th century, which has witnessed significant changes, you know, in the Arab perception of oneself and the Arab establishment of another. And so this was quite important. Well, you had another point that I forgot what was.
Oh, the agency of the Jews themselves.
Yes. Concerning this point, given these two magazines in specific, or the choice of these two magazines, comes because I focused on a Muslim representation of Jews in order to understand that there is actually this dichotomy between Judaism and Islam. At the beginning of the rise of the Islamic ideology, you know, one of these magazines, Al-Manar, Rashid Rida is one of the pioneers, and he was like, he had a very strong Islamic ideology. As Zayad will focus more on literary and creative texts, you know, and these are two great thinkers at the beginning of the 20th century in Egypt, which had one of the largest communities of Jews in the Middle East and one of the oldest as well. I wanted to see how do two different thinkers, very strong thinkers, approach this, but also Muslim thinkers. Now, accessing Jewish content, that's a different research. My question would be, how do Arab Jews represent themselves? How did they perceive themselves? The changes that have occurred. So I am not disregarding the content, quite the opposite. I am, when I look at the graph, I can only look at the graph from the context. If I'm seeing a peak at 1913, my first question would be, what happened in 1912 and 13? What happened in 1948? What happened in the 30s? I also asked the question, where was the writer, you know, like for instance, Rashid Rida between Turkey and Egypt, how did this influence the way he perceived an other, and he perceived Jews in specific? As well as, I think I entered this research expecting that Al-Risala will give me more, but I actually discovered that Al-Manar gave me a lot more in terms of content, which happens to be, I don't know, because Al-Manar is way more religious in terms of the content. It focuses a lot on the religious ideology, and Al-Risala does not. So I expect that maybe in something less ideological, I'll see more representation or soft representation of Jews. But in fact, it was a straightforward, strong representation in Al-Manar, in less creative and more open or more articles, you know. And I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, if I can add something, because your question is exactly with regard to the validity of using digital marketing and also stuff like historical events or one of the major things in addition to what Safea mentioned is the development of the term and how the use of the term developed over different periods of time. And it takes you into the historical context that she mentioned. Like, you find that the term Zionism, for example, it changes the way it is used in the Arab world over different periods of time. Why did this happen? So we look at the historical context. That's like, we use the history to guide the close reading after that. And sometimes I think we find some choosing for choosing is a different story. Because both critiques of the Risala are supposed to be like more basically focusing on literary and cultural content, while Al-Manar is more like religious, and at the same time, the time is way to find both is very interesting. Because they intersect with like different disciplines, with the history, literature, cultural, and political science, and Rashid Rida, specifically, like he was like the main writer in the from a specific writer to contribute to Al-Manar. And with the background of those writing, it gives you an idea of what was going on and during this era. It's not to measure. We are discussing right now, Germany, with happening in Palestine, the East West encounter. I hope this adds something.
Can I have any further questions on the virtual side or the real side? Okay. If there are no further questions, I think we can wrap up. Hopefully, discussion over lunch will be more spontaneous and more engaging. Okay. We come back at 2:30. And yeah, we will be hearing from Mr. Coppens and David Owen and take care.
Is to begin using occurrences and other forms of statistical analysis to look at a more quantitative dimension to this research. And that is all we have for today. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, David, for understanding the talk and the questions. If any from the audience online or the audience here. David, can you hear us?
I'm still having I mean I can tell that you're speaking, but I can't really hear very distinctly.
Now it's clear.
That's better. That's better. Thank you.
David, can you hear me now?
I can hear, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation. And the question for you. First of all, why did you choose Khadija and the second question is, can you apply the authentication process for another word?
You can repeat the question loudly.
Yeah, if anyone, if you have a question, if you'd like to ask, please please just drop it in the chat box. It's very difficult to hear distinctly what people are saying. Ah, okay. Fatima asks why I've chosen Khadija in particular. I mean, there are a number of different ways to think about that question. One is when you start studying the post-classical tradition, the first work that most scholars will recommend that you read in logic is the Sullam. So if I hadn't been looking at the Sullam and interested in the Sullam to begin with, I probably wouldn't have come across Khadija. Another reason is that I actually, you know, I had we hear about the role of so there's a sort of topic in Islamic studies about the role of women. So, for instance, there's been literature in recent decades on the role of female qadis in Syria, for instance, from Monique Cardinal, one of Al-Halaq's students. And most of the sort of substantive research on women's role in Islamic studies has been focused on the modern period. This is very interesting research, and I've learned a lot from it. And yet, when I would go back and look at the pre-modern period, I would always find myself looking in manuscript collections for women's names, and it was very difficult to find. It's Cardinal, if memory serves. Just giving that as an example. I could give you other examples of recent literature on the role of women ulama. But the primary example that we have in Islamic history are of muhaddithat, of women who transmit hadith in the pre-modern period. And of course, we also have examples of women who were poets, right? You know, there are obvious examples of famous women Sufi poets, for instance. But of women who contribute to the so-called intellectual or rational sciences, the ulum aqliya or ma'qulat, it's very hard to find examples of women's production in these areas. And even to find examples, not just of women in the tarjamas, but of actual works in manuscript collections is very, very rare. So you know, I sort of set out from the very beginning to always make a note. Anytime I saw a woman's name in a manuscript collection, I would take down that number always, and then I would always follow up on that. And it seemed to me that of all the women referenced in the manuscript collections in the Islamic sciences, and I wasn't able to find many examples. It seemed to me that Khadija was the one whose work was the most likely to be editable. That is to say, I was able to find multiple manuscript references. And when I started looking at her network, it seemed like the individuals around her were really, really prominent individuals. Her brother and son, Ahmed, is a very important commentator on Sanusi's theology. She's reputed, and there's a dispute about this, but she's reputed to be the teacher of Ibn Buna, very possible, one of the most important grammarians of the 19th century. And the West African Fula Jihad states, the nearest one to her is led by a certain Abdul Qadir. Obviously not the Algerian Abdul Qadir, the Futi Abdul Qadir. He's the major political leader in her region during her period, and he's said to be her student as well. So before I started going to Mauritania to try to get usable images of her work, it became clear from her networks that this person isn't just a sort of mythical name. She has a very rich social network around her. There were multiple manuscripts of her work. And then once I got to Mauritania, I saw that people were still reading her work. People were still commenting on her work, still studying her work. So I think for all of these reasons, it seemed to me that she's a really, really important figure to bring out into the public sphere and to make her work available to the broader public. And I should also mention that the translation I'm doing of the Sullam, which is very possibly the most widely distributed logical text in the Arabic and Islamic world, it's never been translated into English. There's one translation, I reference it in the slides. There's one translation by Luciani, I think from 1921 into French. And there hasn't been any systematic treatment of the Sullam since then. And you think, people study Farabi and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, and that's good, that's necessary. But in terms of the logic that Muslims and Arabs read day to day, there are many more people reading the Sullam than there are reading, Al-Kindi or Al-Farabi. In terms of just, you look at the number of commentaries, it goes without saying the number of ijazas. By a number of metrics, the Sullam is at least as important in terms of its total distribution as a lot of the better known classical works. So making the Sullam available in a sort of period appropriate medium alongside an important neglected commentary on the Sullam, it seemed like this was an absolute top priority for understanding the history of Arabic logic.
We have and we have another can you hear me?
Yeah, so the question as to why did I choose the translations that I did, this is based on my translation. There's no other translation into English of the Sullam that I'm aware of, and I'm quite certain there's no other translation of Khadijah's Turra on the Sullam. So the only available English translations are my own. And as for the use of the automation process for other works, I would say we haven't tried doing that yet, but the idea is that the same automation process, we're hoping to apply it to other works, and I'm optimistic. As soon as I have more data on that, I'll certainly let you know.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I hope you can hear me. Can you?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Mr. Peter. Thank you for this interesting talk. And we're gonna have a coffee break for 10 minutes and half an hour, and then we'll come back to continue with the next session. Thank you very much for being with us.
Hello everyone. This is Āqil. at second year of comparative literature at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. I'll be the chair of this session. We have two presenters, and let's start with Dr. Cornelis van List. Is a postdoc at Utrecht University, and he's recently published among digitized manuscripts with the press in hardback and electronic open access. It is a handbook for working with digital photos of text materials, especially manuscripts. Van List has encouraged computer support solutions in Islamic and Arabic studies for a number of years through his online magazine, The Digital Orientalist. He currently investigates Ibn Arabi and his commentators on the imagination. So let's start. Please go ahead, Dr. Cornelis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy that we're finally here at this conference, and happy to be talking about my contribution here, and very excited to hear about the other contributions tomorrow. So what I've been working on after my book Among Digitized Manuscripts, which was focused on digital photos of manuscripts, I started looking at the digital photos of editions, or rather scans. And we're all very aware of scans of editions. I think most of us are primarily using scans of editions. And well, I've been wondering, can we meaningfully extract the information that's available in these scans to get some kind of plain text version out of it? And in the end, because my work is focused on commentary traditions, in my specific case right now on Fusus al-Hikam by Ibn Arabi, which received many commentaries, over 100, perhaps over 140 commentaries in total. I also was thinking about the structure that these different texts have to each other. And so commentaries, of course, have a very specific structure to each other. They have a relationship where a commentary has the full text of a source text, of the matan, and then expands on it by interjecting at different points new words. And so I didn't only want to capture a fairly accurate version of the text, but I also wanted to capture this relationship that different texts have with each other. And I started working on a tool together with Dirk Roorda, who's a data scientist at the Royal Academy of Sciences in the Netherlands. And we came up with a Python library that we, for better or worse, just called Fusus, since that's the primary corpus that we were working on. And you can visit it. You can look at for more information on among.github.io/fusus/fusus. There you will find all the documentation for this. And here I will walk you through some of the technical steps and also give you some of the sort of philosophy behind it. So this is the image you're seeing here is a scan, but also on top of it, we placed the text that we got after OCR extraction. And so this was for us, this is a visualization for us to manually check OCR output. There's a lot of things going on here. So the most important thing here is that we're using Kraken as the OCR engine, all right? We found that to be very reliable. And from Kraken, you not only get the characters, but you also get the position and you get the accuracy rate or rate that Kraken itself is certain about the result. And so we use those results to then push again the plain text onto the image and give it a color code. So red and orange and yellow are words that Kraken is not entirely sure about. All right. Now, to achieve this, we did actually quite a lot of steps. It's one thing to just simply give a page to Kraken and receive the results back. But this is not entirely what we were after for. This would be convenient if you're working on a very large corpus that has, hundreds of works in it, and you don't mind that it has a lot of garbage in it, such as page numbers or headings or footnotes, all kinds of things that we don't consider part of the actual historical text, right? So we want to extract the text, but only the text. And how can you go about that when all you have is scans of editions? Well, these editions, once you start to look at it from this perspective, you start to realize just how much information is contained in an edition. And most of the information is contained in the layout of an edition. The editor will present the text in such a way that it conveys meaning. So at the top, there's a running head with a title, a page number, and you see here that there are actually 2 columns, and you see that the headings are typeset differently from the main text, and these are all clues that are very easy for human beings to sort of absorb and turn into meaning, but it's a little more difficult actually to instruct a computer to make meaning out of it. And yet we thought that this was really the only thing that we could do, not only to extract a meaning, but also actually to increase the accuracy. So allow me to get into it. This is the first step that we applied. We take an image of a page and then we flatten it. We make sure that it's oriented as flat as possible, and then we simply start to divide it vertically. All right, and we start to divide it vertically so that we have these bands all over the page that we can then use to manipulate the page. So taking these bands, we see that there is a band for the page header, and then there's a band for the first paragraph of text. Then there's this band that has 2 columns. Then there is emptiness, actually, right? And then another paragraph, 2 columns, another paragraph. So if you do this for an entire volume, then you can add some of your human knowledge. A human can look at it and say like, oh, well, this is what it means to have like a page with paragraph and a band that has 2 columns. It means this and that. And then you can target just those pieces on the page that you actually want. So in our case, we remove the page heading that has the title and the page number. And on this image, we don't see any footnotes, but of course, you know that many editions have footnotes. Once we have detected that the lowest band is footnotes, we remove that as well. It's not necessary for us to deal with footnotes. So we get to a narrower part of the page that has the actual text that we're concerned with. Now, for each of these parts of the page, we apply again an analysis, and turns out to be a very colorful analysis. As you can see, that's more of a coincidence than anything else. But in all of these cases, all of these things that you see going on are histograms, really. Okay, and so if we take the top one, and I hope you can see my my mouse pointer, then you can see that there's like these this green ridge going along the width of the page for this paragraph, and it basically just is that we drop a line from top to bottom like this, and we just count a number of black pixels. And the number of black pixels we plot as a ridge over here, and we do that for all of these lines. And so, of course, if we drop a line here, then there are no black pixels. So the count is 0. So we know that only for those lines, vertical lines that have a certain count, there is text. And so from the entire width of the page, now we can narrow it down to just where we know the text is, because there are black pixels there. And we do that too for horizontal lines, going from left to right. We let the computer count the number of black pixels along left to right lines, and we plot that, and we can see, of course, then these kinds of shades, these hills start to appear, and for every hill we know that there is a line of text, and this is a way for us to very accurately pinpoint where are lines of text. We also have these, again, these orange lines, or sort of visualizations. It is a way for us to determine where approximately the line of text ends. And it's a bit more of a complicated measure, but it is, again, based on the histogram method. So now we know exactly where text is. We know where it starts on sort of the width of the page, and we also know where each line of text is. So now that we know where lines of text are, we can start to look closely at each of these lines. And I will come back to this in a minute, actually. Let me just show you this, because it is this is a good visualization to see what's going on the line level, right? So now we're just looking at lines, and what we thought would be very good is to eliminate beforehand all kinds of things that we don't need in the edition anyway. In this case, you see lots of commas being identified. Here's a comma, here's a comma, here's one, there's one. So we created a blueprint for what a comma should look like. And this is something you need to custom make for each edition, because a comma will look differently in each edition, of course. And then we just sort of template match it. We just take the blueprint of the comma, and we start to see where, not just on the page, but in specific parts of the line of the text, does a comma appear. And a comma, we, for this edition, have identified as appearing in the middle of a line. So you take a line of text, and now we identify different parts of that line, so that we have the highest accuracy of finding different things that we actually don't even want, because a medieval text doesn't have commas. So why would we give commas to Kraken if we are going to take it out anyway? We might as well take it out beforehand. So we do that too with vocalization, as you can see, right? This vocalization was identified, and you may wonder, like, how is it possible to identify just a tiny mark like this? Well, it's possible because we're only looking in between the green and the blue line. In this part of the text, we're looking for vocalization. All right. That's why it was important to us to identify where lines are, so that we can really target different parts of the line in order to find these things. Footnotes as well, we get rid of them, right? And all of that. And it's easy enough to find them once you start looking for them in the right place. If we would just be looking for this in the entire page, then everything would be identified. Like a little part like this would be equally identified as this as well. We do an additional test for each hit that we get. We do an additional test, and that's actually what you've seen here. We take a template, for example, like this, and then we start to see in very specific parts of the page where it does the template match. But additionally, we give it some parameters to not identify parts of actual text. So this, for example, because it's connected to the text, we say like, okay, well, maybe the pattern looks like it, but it's part of the text, so you shouldn't identify it. And here it is actually disattached from the text, so we can correctly identify it as the mark that we are looking for. We're looking for these marks in order really to eliminate them, because by eliminating information from scans of editions, you get a much higher accuracy once you give it to an OCR engine. So the cleaner your input is to an OCR engine, the cleaner your output is. And this has been, according to us, this has been sort of the main tour de force of our efforts, that most people would think of it like, okay, we give it to an OCR engine, and then we start to clean whatever comes out of the OCR engine. And we thought, like, why don't we start cleaning already before? Why don't we give Kraken only those parts of a scan that we actually want to turn into text? So footnotes are eliminated, and footnote marks in the text are also eliminated. Punctuation like a comma or colon, all of that is already gone before we even give it to Kraken. This is how we handled scans of images. On this next slide, I just want to make a quick detour for those of you in the know. We also had in our possession a typeset PDF of an edition. So it was not a scan, but it was an actual digital document containing an edition of Fusus al-Hikam by Ibn Arabi. Now, for those of you who are, have some experience with Arabic digital typesetting, you must know that it's quite a complicated manner, and there are all kinds of difficulties involved once you start to extract the text. So we actually built a small toolkit to help us with that. In this case, there was a whole range of unique Unicode characters that was used just in this PDF to represent certain Arabic letters. And here you see some of the things that we came up with to handle those cases. let me move on. I know I'm going quick, but I'm just giving you sort of a technical tour of all of this, just to give you a sense of the entire pipeline that we built. So you saw that we were able to extract texts from scans of images and also from a digital typeset page. And we already did some pre-cleaning, but now we're doing some post-cleaning as well. We take the OCR results, and I have found actually pandas to be quite a useful way of cleaning it afterwards and structuring the information even further. This is an example of it. What you see here are the first few words and the last with fusus hikam. Each word comes on a row, so each word is a row, and each word has columns that has information. It's got the just the very sort of most compact form of the word, but it also has a fuller version of the word if it's available. It's got information about where on the page it is. So it's on page 8, it's on line 2, that's in column 1, in span 1, with a direction going from right to left. And this is the pixel coordinates on the page. It does not have punctuation after the word or before the word. But this edition had also information about where in a manuscript, the most oldest manuscript of this text, text is. So we we saved that information, and we stored it in this column. And we also, for parts in the fusus that has poetry, we would note the meter and the verse number. And the fas means, in this case, chapter, meaning the fusus of fusus hikam. And 0 means like the introduction. And of course, for those parts that are Quran citation, we would have a column that indicates as much. It cuts off here, but there are a couple more columns with information. So, in short, this is how we went about it. At the top, you see Afifi's edition of Fusus Hikam, which we had in scans, and by means of the pre-cleaning, OCR, post-cleaning, we came up with this CSV file with each word on a new line and with a couple of columns of information about it. At the bottom here, we have a new edition of Fusus Hikam, which we abbreviated to his name of Lakhnavi, and this we had in this digital typesetting. So we extracted it into this, and now we had actually transformed these two editions into these CSV files. A final step that we did was to compare the two, because these are two editions of the very same text. So they should be sort of equal, right? They should match, and should have the same text. Well, we wrote a short comparison algorithm for that, and started to include a couple of exceptions to get things going. My colleague in this does not know Arabic himself, so he was helped a lot by turning the Arabic letters into Latin script. I'll go over the results here. So Fusus Hikam is a text of a little more than 40,000 words, and already an immediate hit was achieved for 87%. So that's basically that's comparing the digital typeset text to the OCR version of the scans. And it kind of represents an accuracy of our OCR pipeline just as is, basically, just as it comes out of the box. But from those 13% that did not immediately correspond, we were able to sort of assign a lot of exception rules just to get the algorithm to understand that, well, it's actually not a discrepancy, it's just something that you were stumbling over. And so in the end, we boiled it down to just 289 actual discrepancies. So these are differences between Afifi's edition and Lahnafi's edition. And of the 289 differences, it's in 100 cases, it's just a honorific, right? It's just after, for example, the name of God or the name of the prophet, you could either add or leave out a honorific. And this is what these two editions sort of differed in. In 25 cases, it's kind of like, just like a substitute, like one or a couple of words were just switched in order, and it doesn't do anything really with the meaning of the text. And then in 164 cases, one or more words were actually added in one or the other text. But in no case did we find, did it truly change the meaning. So this is just an entire overview. We start on the left, and if we have scans, then we start in the top left. And this is an icon for Scan Tailor, very useful program that has a graphical user interface to work with images of text, to flatten it and straighten it out and make it really solidly black and white. If it's a digital typesetting tool, then we found a lot of use in Font Reporter, a small program that gives you a lot of analytical information about what's going on in that PDF, like which fonts are used, which private use characters are used, which characters are used and how much. All of that information is really helpful in deconstructing a PDF. To reverse engineer it, basically. For the scans, of course, I went over it in quite some detail, how we achieve to extract the text and only the text. Now, once we have either the OCR result or the reverse engineered result, then there is a lot of merit in analyzing them through this merger algorithm. In the end, our aim was to get it in a dedicated data format that is compliant with TextFabric. TextFabric is a Python library that helps you do text analysis on, well, specifically written for ancient texts. And so it is also very helpful for our work on the fusus. I think what I'd like to add here at the end is that we were quite successful with the fusus and hikam. We have yet to start working on the commentaries themselves, but we found it necessary to really put a lot of effort in fusus and hikam, since the idea is to use the entire text of the fusus as an index, basically, onto which we can add the commentaries. By having each word of the fusus in a different row, we can assign it a number, and then we can attach texts from the commentaries to these numbers wherever the commentary sort of interjects in the text. So establishing this index was very important to us. And I think we were quite successful in it. I think I should leave it at that. Just as a final note, why is it neither a corpus nor an edition, right? So a corpus would mean a very, very large data set containing lots of text that doesn't care about accuracy that much, that doesn't care about having any kind of structure. And this is not something that we could really make use of, since these commentaries have so much structure baked into them that we felt it absolutely necessary to have the data in a very structured manner and also have some sense of accuracy. But neither is it a full edition. We didn't go for a TI XML kind of edition. That's sort of the nitty-picky work that's not required either, because we do intend to include quite a lot of commentaries and balloon up to, say, a data set of a couple of million words, perhaps, right? So this highly detailed level would not be achievable either. It is something right in between, and we think there's a space for it. We think there's a space for digital humanities in between the highly detailed microscopic editions and sort of this maximalist view of a text corpus of a civilization. I'm again very thankful for your attention and look forward to your input, comments, questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Lith, for this amazing presentation. And if anyone has a question, please go ahead. Okay, no questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. I want to ask you, while scanning the text, you said you removed the marks, the small marks, including also harakat. Okay, so you know that this play a role in like hermeneutics of the text. So do you bring it back, or I mean, some harakat or some of those marks play a role in the meaning of the word. So how do you bring it back to the text later?
Yes, no, of course, a good question. And this is really up to, you know, this is up for debate. It is that of all things is a marginal decision. It is my impression that most harakat in editions are added by the editor, right? And are interpretations, if you will, of the editor, and not necessarily represent the evidence available in manuscripts. So since I would like to sort of move beyond the editor and go back to a basic text as possible, I at least wanted to have the option to remove harakat. Yet again, I think for the vocalization, there's a good argument to be made to keep it, because OCR engines in general are able to deal with it quite all right, and then you can still add it later, like I showed. I had two columns, one with just the word and a column with the words with full vocalization. So you can have that. It's useful to have it without if you're doing multi-text searches for passages, right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Now we are going to another presenter, Dr. Michel Freshkopf. He's the professor of music, director of the Canadian Center for ethnomusicology, adjunct professor of medicine, and adjunct professor of religious studies. He holds the PhD from UCLA University in ethnomusicology and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Yale University. His research includes social network analysis, digital storage, virtual reality, and machine learning for sound recognition, and biofeedback driven soundscape. Also, his field work in Egypt, Arab, and West Africa includes music and Islam, Sufi ritual, popular music, and music for development. Please, Dr. Freshbach, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, good evening, everybody, and it's early morning here. I'm sorry I couldn't actually be with you in person, but this is the next best thing. Thanks very much to Professor Eid Mohammed for organizing, and to Safea. So I'll share my presentation. I haven't used this WebEx before, so I'm not sure.
So at the window, like at the very below, you will find like a link to share.
Yeah, it's just saying I have to give it permission, so okay. Do that later. All right, let me see if the share works now.
If not, you can email it to us and we will present it on your behalf.
Yeah, it'll be a little tricky because I have lots of animations. Let me just see. Okay, it looks like I might have to exit and come back in, so I'm sorry about that. I've shared, let's see. Yeah. Let me just try exiting and come back. Sorry. Okay, now I think it's working. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
You can see. Okay, good. So let me just make it a slideshow. It should appear full screen.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So thank you again. I'll start. I'm going to be talking about poet-composer collaborations in Egyptian song using social network analysis. Here on the right, you can see the most productive collaboration between Hussein Essayed and Muhammad Abdul Wahab, 114 songs. In this talk, I want to do several things. First of all, I want to introduce ethnomusicology because I have a feeling many of you don't know the field, as well as social network analysis. And then I'll illustrate SNA's potential for digital humanities research in music. And then finally apply SNA to a database of Arabic songs played over Egyptian radio. And this is research still in progress. So first of all, what is ethnomusicology? We in ethnomusicology study music, but considered very broadly as behavior, as composition, as a commodity, as channels of distribution like radio, as meaning, as an archive, including metadata about music. So ethnomusicology broadly considers musical societies,
musical objects, musical communications, and musical cultures. And all of these phenomena are representable as networks. Although most of my colleagues do not do this, but this is a technique I'm interested in. What is social network analysis then? Social network analysis takes as its starting point the premise that social life is created primarily and most importantly by relations and the patterns formed by these relations. Unlike most quantitative sociology tending to atomize society through anonymous surveys, say, or the kind of thick descriptive approach that typifies most ethnography and anthropology, SNA focuses on relations among agents, whether they're social or possibly cultural. It represents those relations as a network of nodes, that is, agents, each with non-relational attributes. Then it infers social structure, for example, the centrality of an agent, the cohesion of a subgroup, from relational data by analyzing empirical network data algorithmically. And visualization is commonly used to represent the network in order to drive intuition and explore the data. Some of the sources include ethnographic fieldwork, survey research occasionally, data mining, increasingly common via social media and music online, and then archival or database research, which is what I'll illustrate today. So what's a social network exactly? A social network is a set of socially relevant nodes connected by one or more relations. The network then is nodes representing agents plus the links or ties connecting them. Those nodes include attribute data, non-relational agent properties such as age, gender, wealth, nationality, and so on. Relational data tells you what or who is connected and how. The connection may have a direction or may be directionless. It may have a weight or strength, and it may have a duration, as in longitudinal data. Often networks are represented graphically in a diagram. So here's a node, two linked nodes, two nodes with a directed link indicated by the arrowhead. Now the link has a weight of 15. In a weighted network, a higher link value may imply a stronger connection, or possibly a weaker connection. It depends on how it's interpreted. Networks are easily grasped through visualization in a connection diagram like this one. But there are other ways of defining the same undirected network. In this case, it's undirected. So we have the diagram. We can list the links as rows of node pairs, unordered. So we see A goes to B, B goes to C, and so on. Or it can be shown as an adjacency matrix where 1 means connected and 0 means not connected. In this case, it will be symmetric because every time a node is connected to another node, that second node is also connected to the first node. And so you really only need triangle, the upper or lower triangle. We could also add weights to all three. We could add weights to the diagram. We could add it as a third column in the list of links. Or we could replace the ones in that matrix where it says connected with the weight of the link. Two key relational node properties are degree and centrality. The degree is the number of links, or the number of neighbors is assuming that there's no multiple links. In other words, two nodes A and B are not connected by multiple links. The average degree has something to do with the network density because the maximum value is when every node is connected to every other node. Centrality gives you an index of node importance. There are several metrics. Degree centrality is 1, just counting how many neighbors. Betweenness centrality, closeness centrality, and eigenvector centrality are 4 possible metrics. Let's look at degree. Here we have an empty network. Everything has degree 0, no neighbors. Now it's been fully connected. Every node connects to every other node, so it has degree 6. Here's a ring network. Every node is connected to a right and left neighbor. By the way, the arrangement of the nodes is totally arbitrary. It's only the connections that matter, but we tend to arrange networks so as to make them most readable. So far, all the nodes had equal degree centrality, but this isn't normally the case. Here's a star network. Here, A is the most central in 3 senses. It has the highest degree, 6. It's the closest to the other nodes, so it has high closeness centrality, and it's the only node lying between other nodes. It has the only non-zero betweenness centrality. Here's a network which is kind of interesting because degree and betweenness centrality part ways. Nodes B and C have the highest degree, 3, Node A's degree is only 2, but A has a higher betweenness centrality because it serves as a broker between two sections of the network, as you can see. So far, we've assumed that all links are weight 1, but in my analysis of Egyptian songs, that won't be the case. So let's change that. We'll look at weight 3 here between A and B, and weight 4 between A and C, meaning it's a tighter tie, stronger connection. The weighted degree measures the sum of link weights rather than the number of neighbors. So for example, weights might count collaborations. Here A has degree 2, but it has a weighted degree of 7 because we're adding 3 plus 4. There are 2 neighbors, but 7 collaborations. Assuming that all the other links have weight 1, then B's weighted degree is 5, and C's weighted degree is 6, even though they only have degree 3 in terms of neighbors. Eigenvector centrality is a little bit complicated, and maybe I won't take the time to actually explain it all, but it suffices to say that it's a recursive metric where a node centrality is proportional to the sum of its neighbors' centralities. And this is actually, without going through all the math, this is the basis for Google's PageRank algorithm, which tries to pull up the most important pages when you do a search. So here are some centrality metrics on a single network. It's kind of interesting to look at the differences. Here, the brighter colors indicate greater centrality. You can see betweenness centrality, closeness centrality, eigenvector centrality, and degree centrality on exactly the same network. This came from Wikimedia Commons. Now, another thing that we look at in networks is the cohesive subgroups. And just as for centrality, there are a variety of measures used to detect them. There's the clique, which is a fully connected subgroup, the K-core, which is a maximal subnetwork where each node has K neighbors, but not necessarily connected to all of the others. There are M-slices in a weighted network, which are groups of nodes connected by links of minimal weight, M. There are components, which are completely separable pieces of the network. The network comes apart. And then there's other community detection algorithms, such as Louvain clustering and many, many other techniques. Let's look at components. Networks need not be connected, and those pieces of networks are called components. So here's one network, but in 3 components, as illustrated by the colors. I'm not sure what that was.
Sorry, one of the audience.
Okay. So here's a totally random network where we've constructed a link with probability 1.5%. And here are the components. You can see that there are 3, where there's 2 larger components, more than 20 nodes, and then 3 very small components up at the upper left, and then the rest of the nodes are all isolated. For larger networks like this one, usually we apply a force-directed drawing algorithm, such as Fruchterman Reingold or Kamada-Kwai, which helps to reveal the network structure by positioning nodes near their neighbors, shortening stronger links, and avoiding line crossings. So it makes a nice network diagram like this one. The links between the students in this network indicate that they enjoy listening to the same artists. This is artificial data, but here we have a bunch of students, and a link means that they like at least 2 artists in common. And then we can mark friendships between certain students, and we see that those friendships align with the musical taste links. We then can run Louvain method clustering, and the clusters do indeed include the friendships. So perhaps these communities are meaningful. Typically with SNA, you need to do more research to interpret the results. It's not enough to mechanically turn the crank, so to speak, but you need to look at what you got. So questions about a social network center on analysis plus interpretation. What and why? What is the network's average degree? How is degree distributed and why? Which nodes are most central and why? In a weighted network, which pairs of nodes are most strongly connected and how are the line weights distributed and why? Where are the cohesive subgroups and what is the significance of those subgroups? Much of this research is exploratory and is facilitated by software tools, most of which are free and are easy to use, such as Payek, which is the one I use in most of the work today, iGraph, Gephi, and other packages. So in music studies, we might ask, how do social networks shape music, for example, taste or style or collaborations? People collaborate because they know each other. How does music form social networks? For example, might form friendships or might provide the basis for collaborations. How does music diffuse through social networks, for example, through social media? Now, song collaboration is an interesting topic because it implicates many, many aspects of music as considered broadly by ethnomusicology. Songs require collaboration between usually a composer and a poet, so there's a behavioral aspect. Songs are recorded, typically, in the modern era as a commodity. Recordings are broadcast through radio, among other ways. Radio stations maintain song databases, so there's an archive. And the song metadata includes composer, poet, singer, and title, among other things. So this database implies a network. Each song links its creators, links the composer, poet, and singer. I'm going to consider composer and poet only today, but in the future I want to look at singer also. So we'll let composer and poet be connected by a link whose weight is the number of songs in which they have collaborated. What is the structure of such a network? Where are the cohesive subgroups? What are the most productive collaborations? Who is most central? How does it develop over time? And then we need to answer the why questions, which are interpretive and typically will depend on a contextual analysis of the society and the history in which the network is embedded. So now we'll look at Egyptian radio's song database. Here are the first 18 of over 14,000 complete rows, each representing one song recording held by Egyptian radio. Each artist, poet, composer, or singer is represented as a network node. Each song implies a network link between collaborating artists. Here, songs are replicated because there can be multiple recordings per song, maybe by the same artist or by the same singer or by a different singer. So we need to eliminate those duplicates and also carry out some other preliminary steps. Here are some of the steps I had to carry out. First of all, cleaning the data is always a huge task. Usually in big data type analysis, takes up the majority of your time. Just standardizing all the spellings and fixing typographical errors. Then correcting and adding information. If you can't find the information, removing incomplete rows. Deduplicating, because every triple composer, poet, and title should happen only once, unless it should happen that a composer and poet composed 2 songs of the same title, which is very unlikely. So we get rid of all those multiple listings. Then we have to convert to a network file format. I used PIAC. Every song generates one link. We replace multiple links between a poet and a composer with a single weighted link. And now we have a network in which the weight of each link represents the number of song collaborations between composer and poet nodes. As I mentioned, I used PIAC. So it turns out there's about 12,500 distinct songs by 1,500 or so poets and about 700 composers. There are a total of nearly 6,000 collaborations, each representing one or more songs, because the collaboration could be multiple songs. The weight of the link is the number of collaborations. So now we'll do some analysis. We'll describe the network connectivity, first of all. Then we extract some of the M slices, looking at only the high weight links. We delete the links of weight less than M, run component analysis, and eliminate node isolates. Then we analyze the resulting network for centrality and cohesive subgroups. And then we can repeat that for higher M values until we get some interesting structure. We can also simply list the highest weight links, which is a very simple operation and very interesting, and it highlights productive collaborations that would not be visible in any other way. We can also classify artists by historical period and then repeat the analysis with that in mind. Finally, we would want to interpret all these results in relation to the environment, the history, the culture, the politics, and so on. First of all, connectivity. The network contains just over twice as many poets as composers. Since every link connects a poet and a composer degree is about double that of poets, meaning composers are on average more collaborative than poets. Many collaborations are weak. Nearly 70% are just a single song, and many artists are weakly connected. So the strong portion of the network is fairly small. Considering collaborations of at least 10 songs, it's just 131 artists, of whom 66% are connected in a single large component, and the rest in smaller components of 2 to 4 nodes each. The top 20 collaborations are interesting to look at. The line values here indicate the number of songs, and you'll see this very striking collaboration I alluded to earlier between Muhammad Abdul Wahab and Hussein Assayed, 114 songs. These high weight links tell stories. Each one would have some kind of story behind it, why these particular individuals collaborated, and what the history of their relationship was. Now here's collaborations on at least 10 songs, colored by component and arranged using Kamada Kwai. In other words, we've eliminated links of weight less than 10 and then deleted node isolates, and this is what we have left. You see there's a lot of individual pairs, and then there's one large component at the upper left in yellow. Now we isolate the large component. Here I've colored the composer's green and the poet's yellow, so it's more visible, and you see that they alternate. Composer works with poet, works with composer, and so on. Certain nodes seem to be more central. Let's try to isolate those. Here's collaborations on at least 18 songs. This will make the network a little bit easier to read. Again, sometimes the composer is central, sometimes the poet is more central. Here now we're going to try to make that more visible by drawing the node size proportional to the degree, the number of collaborators, and some central nodes then emerge. Abdul Wahab Muhammad, the poet, Muhammad al-Mugi, Baligh Hamdi, and Muhammad Abdul Wahab, composers, as indicated. Why are they central? Why are they the most central? There's other famous artists, but why are these in particular? We could also do this by drawing node size proportional to the weighted degree. The weighted degree would be the number of songs that they've collaborated on. And we get the same names, albeit in a slightly different relative order. This network shows the 10 most important nodes as determined by eigenvector centrality and now arranged using Kamada Kwai. So these are the nodes that are most central by using this recursive metric, where your centrality depends on the centrality of the people you work with. How can we explain these results? You see up in the upper left, again, Muhammad Abdul Wahab and Hossein Said very close together. Now let's add historical periodization to the analysis. I divided into 3 eras: the classic song era up to 1945, the modern song, which is really the heyday of radio from the 40s through the 70s, and then pop songs where the song production moves out of radio, moves more to private production, at first on cassette, and radio diminishes in importance. So it's that middle period and the earlier period to some extent where Egyptian radio is most central. Then I sampled. I wasn't able to get the data for every artist, but I took 74 poets and 70 composers, adding their year of birth, and then assigning an era at age 20. So we ended up with a certain number of artists for each era. And here you can see the total number of songs per artist, collaborators per artist, and songs per collaborator. And we see that it drops significantly in the pop era. We can speculate on various reasons for this, and I'll get into that more later at the end of the talk. Let's go back to the top 20 collaborations and now look at it by era. So if we look at the top 20 collaborators, we have 13 classic, 14 modern, and only 2 pop, forming 3 main components, with certain figures clearly central in those 3. The first component on the right is primarily the classic era, and then the middle one, number 2, is a mix of classic and modern, and the one on the left is modern. We can also raise the slice number up to 21. Now we're looking at minimum 21 song collaborations. And we see that this slice differentiates by component the classic and modern eras very nicely. In 1, we see mostly classic, and in 2, we see mostly modern. We can also run Louvain community detection, as I did earlier, on a 10 slice, that is 10 minimal songs. And this also separates the classic and modern. But the popular contemporary era from the 70s or the 80s onward is not really represented in this analysis. So here are some results and some further questions. First of all, composers exhibit a higher degree and are more collaborative. Greater musical specialization of song composers in a poetry-centric society. Poets may produce non-song poetry and are more likely to be amateurs than are composers. As musicians, composers are closer to singers and producers who request songs from them directly, and then composers typically request text from an available poet or possibly use a poem from a diwan rather than the other way around. Higher network density in the classic and modern eras. Now there's a question, does this difference stem from changes in the ways musicians collaborate? That is, that they used to collaborate more around Egyptian radio, and in the modern period, in the contemporary period of popular music, because it's been privatized, there's more of an atomization of those collaboration patterns? Or is it a shift in the mode of production towards the private studios? Or does it result from radio holdings themselves? Because radio tended to reject the modern pop era and possibly doesn't contain that data in their database because they didn't produce these songs. The most productive collaborations, what is the significance of these relationships and why are they typically found among the older musicians? Did older musicians tend to pair up and form collaborative, productive collaborative relationships more than in later periods? High centrality. Several well-known Egyptian composers and poets exhibit high degree in eigenvector centrality. Why? And would betweenness centrality highlight different artists? The classic and modern period can be differentiated as cohesive clusters. What is the significance of other clusterings? We haven't yet investigated those. So some future work. I would like to include betweenness centrality measures and interpret in terms of information flow, which is usually how a betweenness centrality is interpreted, that someone passes information to someone else who passes it on to someone else, and the people who are more between have a key role in that. Look at cohesive subgroups using other metrics and interpret them. What could they mean? And we may need additional metadata in order to do that. For example, do artists from a particular place tend to cohere? Enhance node metadata and extend the analysis. So add more dates, add dates for the songs, add dates, gender, nationality for all artists. And then, as I said, do artists, say from Syria, exhibit greater cohesion? Include directed links. Some collaborations, I've been drawing them as if they're two-way or undirected, but in some cases they're clearly one way. For example, a composer is using medieval poetry. How does that impact the analysis? Adding singers, making collaborations triples rather than dyads. One important result of that would be to increase gender balance because the composers and the poets are almost all men. But if we add the singers, we'll get a lot of gender balance and we can start to do some very interesting gender analysis. Then conduct longitudinal analysis. I've treated the collaboration network as if it's static, but clearly not everybody is present throughout the entire past century and a half. So in fact, nodes and links come and go. People are born and they die, and song collaborations can be interpreted as representing something during a particular period, during the composition of the song and maybe immediately afterwards, but that link doesn't necessarily need to be retained throughout the entire century or so. So we can analyze the development of the network over time in relation to contextual factors. For example, what happens when there's a political change? For example, 1952 or other factors. I just wanted to just add something, kind of a side note, a historical analysis I conducted just to show that this can be done on the Kitab al-Ghani of Isfahani. Isfahani's Kitab al-Ghani lists song collaborations, and I found getting the data out of Hilary Kilpatrick's Making the Great Book of Songs in an appendix, I was able to list around 800 collaborations among 500 artists and end up with this nice picture of poets and composers collaborating. And then we could ask possibly how have patterns of collaboration changed between the medieval and the modern periods, which is an interesting question to raise. So in conclusion, social networks define the context within which music is created and the channels through which musical sound, artifacts, and discourse diffuse. Music is also a key factor in the formation and maintenance of social networks. Song collaborations can shape as well as reflect underlying social networks, and SNA can help reveal and understand these networks. But SNA is not enough. Interpretation of results requires social and historical contextualization. Perhaps SNA generates interesting questions more than answers. But integrated with traditional archival or ethnographic methods long deployed in ethnomusicology, SNA can provide powerful strategies for ethnomusicological research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Krishko. Let's see if anyone has any questions for the professor. Please go ahead.
Okay, I do have a question concerning one of the questions that you asked in one of the slides, which is the most productive collaborators. right? Is there a possibility, and I'm just questioning to understand how the methodology or the SNA can be expanded. If we want to see most productive collaborators, can we go back to the data before we remove the repetitions of the songs, and then we see maybe a song's popularity or how often it is played on the radio, and see maybe if this leads to a stronger connection or a stronger weight on the connection between the composer and the poet?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's interesting to think about other possible ways of representing these connections. So if we look at the number of times, I don't have any way to know how many times songs were broadcast on radio. I would love to know, but we often have to work with the data we have. That would not necessarily, though, imply greater collaboration. However, it might mean that the song is more significant as an indicator of collaboration in the eyes of the general public, or in the ears of the general public, I should say. Now, if you look at songs, the multiple song listings in the database aren't the different broadcasts, but rather they're recordings. So I went over it rather quickly, but basically every recording in their library is represented by a line. So why would there be multiple recordings of a song? You know, let's say Kulthum sang Ana Fintazarik, and they have various versions of that. So they may have, say, 10 copies, then they'll list it 10 times. Now that doesn't mean that there's more, that the collaboration is necessarily stronger. It might be if the poet and the composer were actually involved in rehearsing the song on multiple occasions. So, you know, you end up needing a lot more information than you get out of these tables. And maybe the turning the crank on SNA is not always that meaningful. To really understand the nature of the collaboration, I think requires some historical analysis, because in some cases, as I said, the composer might be using medieval poetry and they're not actually working with a poet at all. So we have to understand something about the relationship. Adding dates would help. So at least you could know whether the two were contemporaries or not and could have possibly worked together. I have a feeling in some cases, we know that some of these poets are song composers, basically. They were poets working at Egyptian radio, composing lyrics for songs, for composers. In other cases, though, composers are taking poetry, so it's a more of a one-way connection. It would be really nice to be able to highlight that, and I have a feeling it would have to be done by hand. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Can you hear me first, because I have trouble with the audio?
You had trouble with hearing me?
Maybe. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
This is a great presentation. Thank you so much. I'm certainly interested in systematic analysis of it. So, when we look at Egyptian music and poetry, have you looked into limitations of collaboration? Like, for example, limitations of time and space. So some people might not have collaborated because basically did not live in a similar time, or because someone was away. We look at one of the most famous like, for example, he may not show up because he was from Egypt at some point, but then came later and had very fruitful collaboration at, at the later stage of his life. So have you thought of normalizing these numbers by these political claims, limitations?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, your voice was cutting in and out. Let me give an answer rather than and tell me if this addresses anything. I think the solution to a lot of these issues is to look at the longitudinal network, and I just haven't been able to construct it yet. So with the longitudinal network, you would know that a certain person, the node starts in 1945 and the node ends in, let's say, 2000. The node would actually have a duration, and you could then look at who's contemporary and who's not. The links also should not be allowed to persist indefinitely. So here we have to guess, because when a composer and a poet collaborate on a song, we don't really know how long they collaborated. So if we have an approximate date, let's say even a decade for the song, we can assume that maybe there was a year or two in which that link persists, and then at some point the link should either fade out of existence or just be terminated. And I think then we will be able to take snapshots of the network at different points in time and people who are not contemporary would not even show up in the network at the same moment. And then we could analyze the network during different decades or in different years even. So I don't know if that addresses, as I said, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear everything that you asked, but does that address anything?
Yeah. That answers half the question. The other half is about the place limitation rather than the time limitation.
I'm sorry, the place?
Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the people in the database are Egyptian. They're almost all working in Cairo. It's possible though that some of them composed songs elsewhere in the Arab world, and that the songs were then, recordings were then brought to Cairo. But for the most part, most of the names that I see that I know are sort of the Cairo-based, which, as you know, drew like a magnet people from Morocco to Iraq coming to Cairo and working there. So they might be from different places, but they're working typically in Cairo and producing songs for singers who may have come from different places but are also in Cairo. But it would be very interesting to analyze whether there's cohesion in subnetworks representing different places of origin, or possibly even different musical styles. But all of these questions are interesting to ask, but hard to answer until you have the metadata in your database, and it's not so easy to acquire it. As I discovered, just trying to get dates of songs turns out to be very, very tricky. Just to get the songs of dates. The information is basically not kept in any public databases that I could find. Even the SACEM in Paris, which lists almost all Arabic music in their massive database, their performing rights organization. They have the composer, the poet, the title, the singer, but they don't have the date. I don't know why that information is not kept. I guess it's of more interest to ethnomusicologists and music historians than it is for any legal reason.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. This is very Muhammad. I have a question about the other factors that might play a role also in this kind of collaboration between the composer and the poet, and also the singer, like if this is to be added later on, like the background and how it plays a role in like getting them together. Also the popularity of the specific song at the beginning that makes this kind of collaboration for a long time. And I think it has happened with the composer. For example, Ahmed Rami. And they stayed for a long time because of the successful of these songs. How we can rate or give like some kind of estimate for the popularity of a specific song during the specific period of time. Especially during this time, there was no social media, and the popularity of the song are what we have been told about, rather than we live there or we know that it was popular or not. I'm not sure that it's clear.
Again, I couldn't hear everything, but you gave me some great ideas. So I think that, collaborations probably persist because of song popularity. And if we could, again, map the network longitudinally as a temporal network, we might see that multiple song collaborations tend to induce further collaborations down the line. So if a collaborating pair are very successful with a particular song, in later years, this is in the private sector and it's actually making money. But I think in the earlier years, it was radio actually determining, in many cases, who worked together, or possibly a singer requesting songs. And if the songwriting duo was successful, then they would request more songs from them. And that's probably what happened with Muhammad Al-Wahhab and Hussein As-Sayyid, and why they worked together so much. But what's sort of interesting to think about is whether those kinds of relationships were disrupted later on by the media and by the music industry itself, so that it was no longer possible to have those sorts of very, very successful duos. But I have a feeling that the data is also limited, and partly what we're looking at is the fact that radio itself was an institution that developed in the 1930s and then was promoted heavily after the 1952 revolution, but when the cassette revolution happened in the 70s, radio declined in importance. And so that force was no longer there to promote these kinds of collaborations. And then the whole scene changed completely. So if I can do the temporal analysis, I would look for those technological changes as being probably key moments at which I would expect the network to shift directions.
Yeah, one last point, and then I see there is another question in the chat. But my second point is how we can use this kind of collaboration between composers, poets, and singers to make some kind of like analysis of the change in the social mood, in the cultural mood within a specific nation, let's say the Egyptian nation, for example, over different periods of time. If they maintain this collaboration for 15 years and then there is a change or there is a cut off in this collaboration, this reflects some kind of a change in the mode of the audience. I'm not sure if this would be able
exactly.
to be...
That's exactly what I want to look into. And so if public taste changes, some of these collaborations will fail. Not only the specific collaborations will stop, but those kinds of collaborations may stop. And it may be that songs will start to be created in a new way. For example, there's the rise, probably only since the 80s or so, of the very central role of the arranger, whereas it used to be composer, poet, and a lot of rehearsing. Now it's the arranger and the studio producer kind of pasting songs together. And you get these very repetitive patterns because if any of you have used some of these digital audio workstations, all you need to do is cut and paste, and you can move music around from one song to another one. So the nature of collaboration is changing with technology, with public taste, with the economy, and all of these could be factored into a longitudinal analysis of the network.
Can I just quickly follow up on this? Can we also include the genre of the music? In case it's rap or classical, would that influence that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my classification of the old, the middle, and the new is sort of, very loosely genre related, but it's obviously not very specific. I think that it's just very time consuming. First of all, you have to make a classification which is not cut and dried. It's not like, when did the composer live? It's not clear sometimes what genre or how many genres to define. And do you use the genre names that the public uses, or do you use some musicological genre names? But I think it's certainly an interesting question to explore. And, so the more metadata we can add, those are the node attributes or link attributes. They're not relationships per se, but they allow you to analyze the relationships in the network in a new way. For example, looking at the network that is just defined by rap. Now, I don't know if I would find enough, certainly not in radio database, because they would have rejected. I mean, they tended to reject even the shabby music that became quite popular later. So I would need a broader database.
You have a question in the chat, please. Are you able to read it?
Yeah. With studying the compositions themselves musically, yeah. So that's a good point. And yes, maybe that would help us to classify the music and to understand, for example, even something very simple like how long is the song, which is actually data that's tantalizingly in the database but not complete. But I was thinking that, the very long songs which typified the sort of mid-century, because the very early 20th century, they were short songs because the media could only accommodate the cylinders that people recorded on, and the oldest 78s could only accommodate a few minutes. But then once radio came up and then the LPs, you could have longer songs. And then we fast forward to the modern era, they're shorter songs again. So how does the song length relate it to collaboration? First of all, we could weight the collaboration more when the song is longer. We could weight the collaboration according to the song length. And then we could look at the music itself and see, okay, how complex is it? How long is it? What style is it in? What's the instrumentation? There's a lot of different factors that we could use to try to understand relationships between the network and the larger musical scene. So yes, that's a good point.
Here.
Okay. Okay. I just do have one quick question. Are you at all interested into adding certain weight or depth to your notes by including personal biographical data or not? Because I think there might be something there, and I'm thinking in particular of the collaboration in the radio between Abdul Halim Hafiz, Rahman al-Abnoudi, and Mugi during the war with Israel, and that came with a very particular set of music in a very particular time in Egyptian history. And I'm thinking that some kind of personal biographical data in there might add an interesting historical depth to the analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of these suggestions are great. They all, in the end, for the social network, they entail adding metadata. So, for example, you could imagine marking songs as being political or marking songs as being love songs. Also, if we add dates, then we can look at the particular period of the war and what was composed during that time. So the biography could be mined, essentially, to add additional information to the network. The biography also contextualizes the relationship to help explain. As I said, SNA doesn't really explain anything, it just highlights patterns. So if we want to understand why there's a particular strong collaboration during a particular year, but then we go back to the history and the biography to try to understand that. So yes, absolutely. Analyzing the music, looking at the biographies, these are all different ways of adding information to the nodes and links, which is not essentially relational information, but helps us to understand the relations, the centrality, the cohesive subnetworks, and so on. So all great suggestions I'll try to incorporate. Thank you.
Thank you.
NLP tools, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate your participation, both of you. I know, Mike, it's very, very early right now in Alberta, so thank you so much for being with us today, and I look forward to welcoming you again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. to continue our session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.